Nobody hands you a history book and says, hey, here's how half of all humans who ever lived dealt with one of the most universal biological realities in the story of our species. Because historians have always found roads more interesting than the women walking them, battles more important than the lives being lived between them, and emperors more worthy of ink than the people keeping civilization actually running while everyone else was busy naming things after themselves. And that is exactly the kind of gap that this channel exists to fill. Because history is not just kings and wars and stone monuments. It is the full, complicated, often ignored story of what it actually felt like to be alive. And today, we are going somewhere that no mainstream history class has ever taken you. We are going into one of the most universal human experiences that has existed on every continent, in every civilization, for every generation of women who ever lived. And we are finally going to treat it like the genuinely fascinating history that it is. Before we go anywhere, before Egypt, before Greece, before Rome, you need to understand the scale of what we are actually talking about. Because menstruation is not a modern concept or a recent medical discovery. It is something that has been happening to roughly half of every human population since the very first humans walked out of Africa 300,000 years ago. Which means every single civilization that ever rose and fell, every empire that ever conquered and collapsed, every century of human progress that ever happened with women managing this biological reality alongside everything else they were doing. Building, farming, raising children, running households, trading, healing, surviving. And yet, if you go looking for this in the mainstream historical record, you will find almost nothing. Not because it did not matter, but because the people writing the historical record were almost entirely men, writing from the outside about things they considered worth writing about. And menstruation, apparently, did not make the list.
Okay, stop. It's been baked into our culture for centuries that women's sanitary products are hush-hush, secret, taboo. But when you look at the history of it, it wasn't always that way. What goes into a block story and core power formula is the fundamental understanding that unlocks everything else around us. If women knew how far back we've come, it might change how they see their own bodies today. Now, let's start with ancient Egypt. Because ancient Egypt is where the story immediately gets more interesting than you expect. Because Egypt is doing the most while every other civilization is still working things out. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever found, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains actual references to gynecological conditions. The Egyptians were not ignoring this. They were documenting it. They were writing it down. Egyptian women most likely used softened papyrus or rolls of soft linen, both materials that were everywhere in Egyptian daily life, both absorbent and reusable and entirely practical, which is very on brand for a civilization that also invented calendars, architecture, and dental fillings. But the cultural piece is what makes Egypt the genuine hero of this story.
Because in ancient Egypt, menstruation was not considered shameful or dangerous. It was connected to fertility, to the goddess Isis, to the flooding cycles of the Nile itself, the very force that made Egyptian civilization possible. Women were not locked away. They were not considered contaminated. They continued their lives with minimal disruption. And if you compare that to what comes next, you will understand exactly why Egypt stands apart. Ancient Greece is where things take a sharp and spectacular turn for the worse. Because Greece gave the world democracy and philosophy and mathematics, and also, courtesy of Aristotle, one of the most confidently incorrect biological theories ever written down by a person who was supposed to know better. Aristotle believed that menstrual blood was essentially failed semen. His theory, which was not a fringe idea, but the actual mainstream scientific consensus of the ancient Greek world, was that women's bodies attempted to produce semen exactly as men's bodies did. But because women were inherently colder and weaker, the process failed, and what came out instead was menstrual blood. This framework meant that menstruation was seen not as a normal biological function, but as direct biological evidence of female inferiority. And this idea did not stay in Greece. It spread through Rome, through medieval Europe, through centuries of Western medical thinking. And yet, despite all of that, Greek women were doing something entirely practical and entirely sensible, using soft wool pads and insertions, the same absorbent material that was everywhere in a civilization built substantially around sheep farming.
Greek medical texts actually reference women using wool and lint in exactly this way. And there was also evidence of fabric belts worn around the hips to hold absorbent material in place. Functional, effective, and completely ignored by the men writing philosophy scrolls 2 rooms over.
Rome takes everything Greece started and somehow makes it more dramatic, because Rome gave the world aqueducts and concrete and one of the most sophisticated legal systems in ancient history. And also Pliny the Elder, who wrote a 37-volume encyclopedia of natural history and dedicated a genuinely remarkable amount of it to cataloging everything that menstrual blood could supposedly destroy. According to Pliny, a woman on her period walking through a field would kill the crops. Touching a sword would blunt the blade. Going near wine would turn it to vinegar. Approaching bees would kill them. Encountering a dog would make it go mad. Touching iron would cause it to rust. Bronze would blacken. And in a detail that is almost impressive, she could also apparently repel hailstorms. Which means ancient Rome essentially believed women on their periods were walking environmental hazards of considerable supernatural power. And yet, regular Roman women continued to visit markets, attend temples, raise children, and live their lives. Because they understood, as women always have, that their bodies were doing something entirely ordinary. And Roman women most likely used soft cloth, wool, and sea sponges. The Mediterranean world had easy and direct access to natural sea sponges that were absorbent and soft and reusable after washing. And the gap between what Pliny was writing and what women were actually experiencing tells you everything about who was writing history and why.
Now, we need to stop at something that shaped menstrual practice across almost every civilization on Earth more than any material or invention ever could, and that is taboo. Because across an enormous number of ancient cultures, menstruation did not just trigger inconvenience, it triggered ritual restriction that could fundamentally alter how a woman participated in her own society. In ancient Jewish law from Leviticus, a menstruating woman was considered ritually impure. She could not be touched, could not touch certain objects, and had to undergo ritual purification through immersion in a mikveh bath before resuming normal life. Ancient Hindu texts in the laws of Manu specify that a man who has relations with a menstruating woman will lose his wisdom, his strength, his sight, and his long life, which functioned as a fairly effective deterrent. Zoroastrian texts required menstruating women to be kept isolated in a dedicated area, given limited food, and denied contact with fire, water, and the earth itself, the 3 sacred elements of Zoroastrian belief. And across many indigenous traditions in the Americas and Africa and Asia, women would live temporarily in dedicated moon lodges, though the framing here varies enormously. In some traditions, this was about danger and impurity. In others, the woman in her moon lodge was considered to be at her most spiritually powerful. She was not being punished, she was being set apart, and she would return to her community having completed another cycle with renewed status, which is a framework that looks nothing like punishment once you understand it on its own terms. Medieval Europe gets a deserved reputation for being unhygienic across the board, and this is the period where the practical reality for most women was its most stark, because for peasant women, townswomen, the vast majority of women who were not living in wealthy households, free bleeding was almost certainly the most common reality. Thick wool skirts and layered dark undergarments absorbed and concealed flow, while women continued the constant physical labor that defined their daily lives.
Because stopping for menstruation was not a luxury that most medieval women could afford. Wealthier women used folded rags of soft linen held in place by a belt and washed and reused. And what is genuinely fascinating about medieval medicine is that Galenic medical theory, inherited from ancient Greece and filtered through centuries of European thought, actually encouraged menstruation rather than suppressing it. Missed or absent periods were considered a serious medical problem because too much blood building up in the body was believed to cause illness, which meant medieval physicians prescribed entire herbal regimens to bring menstruation on. Plants called emmenagogues, including parsley and pennyroyal and artemisia and tansy. And here is where medieval medicine accidentally got something right, because several of these plants contain compounds that modern science has confirmed do have measurable effects on uterine contractions. Women had been figuring this out empirically for generations, or anyone wrote it down, in a way that historians considered worth keeping. Traditional Chinese medicine represents one of the most sophisticated ancient approaches to menstrual health anywhere in the historical record.
And it is worth understanding why. Because unlike Greek and Roman medicine, which viewed the female body as an inferior and broken version of the male body, traditional Chinese medicine treated the female body as a complete and coherent system, different from the male body in important ways, but not lesser. And menstruation was not an embarrassment or a source of cultural anxiety. It was a primary diagnostic tool. The timing and color and consistency and volume of menstrual blood were all meaningful information to ancient Chinese physicians about a woman's overall health. Chinese medical texts from the Han Dynasty, dating to roughly 200 BCE, contain detailed discussions of menstrual irregularity and its causes and its treatments. Practically, Chinese women used soft cloth pads made from silk if they were wealthy, or cotton if they were not, held in place by woven belts tied around the waist. And evidence from the Tang Dynasty, around 600 to 900 CE, shows more sophisticated undergarments with integrated fabric pouches for holding absorbent material, which are functionally the direct ancestors of modern reusable pads, meaning China had developed something close to a designed menstrual product over 1,000 years before the West figured it out. The Aztecs are where this history gets genuinely painful, because the indigenous cultures of the Americas had rich and complex medical and social traditions that we know only in fragments now. Because colonization did not just destroy buildings and political structures, it destroyed libraries. It destroyed oral traditions. It destroyed the accumulated generational knowledge of hundreds of civilizations.
And what we know about Aztec menstrual practice is therefore frustratingly incomplete. What we do know is that menstrual blood held significant ritual power in Aztec cosmology, where everything from agriculture to warfare was tied to cycles, and the female cycle was not excluded from that worldview. Aztec women appear to have used fibers from the maguey plant, the same plant that gives us agave, as absorbent material. Maguey was versatile across every area of Mesoamerican life, including food, fiber, medicine, and alcohol. And in many North American indigenous traditions, the woman in her moon lodge was at her most spiritually potent, returning from it with renewed community status, not as a passive victim of isolation, but as someone who had completed a cycle that her entire community recognized and honored. And the fact that we have to say appears to have used, and we believe, and evidence suggests when describing these practices is not a gap in history. It is a wound in it, caused by people who decided some histories were worth keeping and others were not. Here is the fact that tends to genuinely stop people, because the modern disposable menstrual pad, the thing that most people in the Western world today consider completely ordinary and unremarkable, was not invented until the late 1800s. The first commercially produced disposable pad appeared around 1888, a product called Lister's towels, made by Johnson & Johnson. And they failed completely, because Victorian women were too embarrassed to purchase them from a male pharmacist over the counter, so the product quietly disappeared.
It was not until 1921 when Kotex launched an advertising campaign that reframed menstrual products as a hygiene necessity rather than an embarrassing personal item that mass adoption actually began. Which means that for the vast majority of human history, for every civilization we have just walked through, for every generation of women across 300,000 years of human existence, women were managing their periods with cloth and wool and sponges and plant fibers and whatever else was available and effective, and doing so well enough to live full and active and complete lives. The modern pad is barely 100 years old. It is a single breath in the length of this story. Three things stand out from everything we have just covered. And the first is that women were never passive victims of their own biology. Across every civilization, every era, the cultural framework that surrounded them, women developed practical and often genuinely sophisticated solutions to a universal physical reality. They used what they had, they refined techniques across generations, they shared knowledge through oral tradition and community practice and medical lineages that were passed from mother to daughter for hundreds of thousands of years, none of which was written down in a way historians considered worth preserving. And that is the second thing, because the biggest obstacle was almost never material. Wool existed everywhere, cloth existed everywhere, sponges existed around the entire Mediterranean. The problem was always the cultural framework. When a society decided menstruation was shameful or dangerous, it restricted women's movement and participation and labor. When a society treated it as biological or sacred,
women continued their lives with almost no disruption. The material solutions were often identical across civilizations. The cultural consequences were radically and completely different. And the third thing is that we have entire museums dedicated to ancient weapons. We reconstruct battle formations in painstaking detail. We make documentary after documentary about emperors and generals and kings, while the daily experience of half of every human population that ever existed barely appears in mainstream history at all. Cleopatra dealt with this, Roman women dealt with this, medieval peasants dealt with this, Aztec priestesses dealt with this. It is literally ancient history, accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, an entire library of human experience that was almost never written down. And it is about time we started treating it for exactly what it is. History hits differently here. Subscribe if it did.